Hey Brian, today I want to talk to you about your book, Holacracy, Evolution for Organization. And I know that in your book you talk a lot about how Holacracy brings the mechanisms of evolution within the organization and all the benefits that it brings to organizations themselves. Now I kind of want to explore with you how what are the implications of that for beyond the organization, beyond one organization. So society as yeah. So kind of my first question, very simply, is do you think that is the goal that organizations themselves will be just more efficient and more working toward their purpose, which is great for themselves, or do you see any implication, any change that you can foresee on the way we live together as a society?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels between what Holacracy does inside an organization, and then if we take that same lens, that same view of the power of evolutionary design, and bring it outside the organization into our broader world, I think there's a lot of interesting connections to make. So, I cover in my book a lot about what Holacracy does within an organization, which we often don't see much evolution in our organizations today, and certainly nothing that approaches a true evolutionary design algorithm. In our organizations today, they look a lot more like kind of an upfront, predictive, top-down design that is actually, if anything, it fights change, it fights evolution, as opposed to something that is a systemized form of constant experiment, test, amplify what works, decrease what doesn't, change, evolve. And actually, the interesting thing, though, is I think if we look one level up from our organization and we look at markets, we actually see a whole lot of evolution happening at the market level. And I mean evolution in a very specific way. It's the evolutionary algorithm of test against some fitness function, have some encoding of a design, vary the code, test. We're used to that in our biological world. We think of it as in our DNA as our code of the design, and we vary it, we test it against fitness and amplify what works and reproduce and spread. Markets do the same thing, and we see that across organizations, across firms. But now the actual fitness function, usually, not always, is how effectively can we serve our customers, right? So if we are really effective at providing value, we're providing value to someone else in the market level, then our design gets amplified, right? Our overall value, what we're providing, people pay for our services, pay for our goods voluntarily, and we start expanding, we get more of it. Your Apple, you go from nothing to what it is today because they provide a really valuable product and service that people choose to consume. It amplifies their design. And that's not just because people have to pay them, right? There's an evolutionary force there because I get to choose. Do I want to buy a Mac? Do I want to buy another machine? Do I want to buy an iPhone or do I want to buy an Android device? There's an evolutionary function there, a selection that happens, a test, which is really grounded in serving customers, which I think is really cool. So the market, we see an evolutionary process happening around how effectively are our firms serving those that can choose to amplify what they're doing by providing their hard-won money for their products and services. And I think where this question gets really interesting, though, is if we start looking at, well, what gets in the way? When doesn't that evolutionary design in our markets work quite the way I'm painting a picture of? And I think there's a lot in the way right now, and that's some of what I think the lens of evolutionary design can really help inform us of what's blocking that, what's stopping that.
Yeah, and it almost seems to me that sometimes we want those organizations to have obstacles in their way because they have a lot of resources and power. They can also do harm.
Yeah.
And so, does Holacracy play anything there, or does it just make them more efficient at doing that?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. And there's a quote, I'm blanking on where it comes from, but you can Google it and find out. It was a economist a while back who said there's fundamentally two different ways you can make money. Um, there's the economic means, which is you're providing value to somebody that they want to willingly, voluntarily transact with you, and you're not hurting anyone else in the process. You are generating value in the world, and that's being reflected in money flowing to you to amplify your ability to generate value in the world, all through voluntary transactions. He said, and then there's the other way, which is, it's sometimes really hard to generate true value for others. So it's much easier if you can just appropriate the value that they have anyway. And that requires aggression. It requires violence or threat of violence. And a great example of that is the mafia, right? The mafia says, it's really hard to provide valuable services, defense and protection services that somebody actually wants to pay for. So, well, we'll just threaten to, break their window, knock up their store, whatever, if they don't buy our services. Or and that's in some ways easier unless we have a really good legal system and justice system to make that hard and expensive. But to the extent that we don't have a perfect justice system that makes that expensive, it's often an easier means if you can get away with it, right? And I think what you're pointing to is I use the mafia as an example. That's obvious. They're using a different means than generating so much value that others voluntarily, happily part with their money. I was happy to buy my iPhone, not so happy to pay the mafia, right? And that's because one is voluntary and the other's coming with threat of force. And the interesting thing is we see a lot of big corporations today that are actually being, if not as aggressive, perhaps even more so in some ways than the mafia. And it's an easier way to generate cash than actually truly generating generative value. And to the extent they can do that, it screws up the evolutionary algorithm. And we see that today in a lot of forms. We see big companies that are externalizing costs. Why actually try to figure out how to produce our product without pollution if we can just pollute and let somebody else pay the cost of that, right? We can externalize that cost. That's a great example of indirectly, it's not as blatant as the mafia, but it's externalizing a cost that is aggressive in a way. If you are polluting somebody else's land and causing them to have to pay for your cleanup, that's a great example of not truly being generative in the value you're providing, or not completely. And then you see even more blatant examples when it comes to the lobbyists that we often see. A lot of large corporations today will end up saying, what, if we just hire the right lobbyists and get the right laws passed, then we can dodge the need to provide all of that voluntary value by creating whatever barriers or obstacles legally that serve our interests at the expense of our customers' interests ultimately. And that also screws with the evolutionary process and the evolutionary function. It creates weird incentives, and it's kind of mucking in this natural process of, if people don't have the threat of costs externalized onto them or violence or what have you, where would you naturally choose to send your hard-won, hard-earned assets to get the value you want because it works? So, and we see great examples of companies that are taking a very principled, conscious stance in this, like Whole Foods and Trader Joe's and others that are saying, we don't want to use that means of generating money. We want to generate money by generating true value that is systemic in its nature, that is conscious, that's not externalizing costs or relying on lobbyists to get laws that indirectly through a sanctioned means serve our interest at the expense of somebody else's.
Yeah. So then my follow-up question is: then wouldn't holacracy allow those lobbies to be more effective, more powerful? It's like where does holacracy come into play in that, and how does it change the game if it does?
And I think straight up, if we want to have a world where we have purpose-driven companies that are engaging only in voluntary transactions that don't externalize costs or harm others, we need more than just Holacracy. Holacracy, I think, can help internally one company. It can make it a lot more conscious and aware of ways in which it's not generating value or is externalizing costs. It can make it more adaptive. But in our broader world, we need more than just that. We need a system in play that limits the ability of companies to dodge evolution to get to the easier means of using violence directly or indirectly, initiating violence, aggression, I'll call it, in order to get their ends met and amplify their effect in the world. We want companies to only be able to amplify their effect in the world if they're truly generating value without harming others' legitimate property rights and all that in the process. And to do that, we need more than just Holacracy. And I can talk more about that if you'd like.
Well, okay, but first I want to be more specific on how would Holacracy help within an organization to prevent. You mentioned that, and I'm not sure I got the how mechanically. Why would it prevent any organization to externalize costs or those things?
Yeah. Well, if you're following the actual, if you're following the Constitution, which of course is a big if, and there's plenty of opportunities for a company to not really be practicing Holacracy and say they are, but if you really are genuinely abiding by the rules of the game of Holacracy, there is a clause in that Constitution that says it's around what authority you have to act in your roles, and it limits you. It says you may not take any action that violates somebody else's property rights, including others outside the organization. We think of it first within the organization. If you have a role and you have authority to act, you know that your role's authority is limited and you can't violate the domain or the property of another role. So that's the first level Holacracy does. It brings into our organization some boundary management there so that you're not hurting your neighbor's property and your neighbor being another role. But the clause actually extends beyond that. It says not just your neighbor within the company, but your neighbor outside the company. Core to that Constitution is you don't have the right to take an action that is in some way going to control or negatively impact property of anyone, of your neighbors or what have you, whether that's polluting their land or something else like that. But even with that, and this is where I think we really reach the limits of Holacracy, if you're a corporation and you really don't care about generating value the hard way of genuinely generating generative progress in the world and value that people entirely want to pay you for, totally voluntary, and you want to go the easy route, there is an easy route to take, which is just get the lobbyists to pass the right laws so that you don't really have to, and you have the guise of it being legal. You're not actually hurting anyone, right? It's legal. And as I think we all probably have a sense of just intuitively, just because something's legal doesn't necessarily make it right. And on the other side, just because something's illegal doesn't necessarily make it wrong. And by right and wrong here, I mean, there's moral interpretations, but it doesn't necessarily make it generative and supportive of an evolutionary flow just because something is legal or illegal. It's a bit of a different thing. And if you want to fight evolution and not be subject to its harsh forces of making sure you're generating value in the market, one of the best things you can do is just get the system itself changed through legislation. And if you can get the right legislation in place, you can dodge the evolutionary function for a while. Mm-hmm. And that's really tough. And we see that some of the biggest lobbyists for a lot of the regulations we have in place today are large companies. And they're often regulations that hurt entrepreneurs, that hurt the ability of entrepreneurial companies to go do what they want. Look at what's happening with Uber is a really interesting example right now. I love Uber's service. And yet they're having a hell of a time. Or Tesla, I just bought a Tesla. I'm a very proud Tesla owner now. I love the car. And they're having a lot of trouble too now with auto dealerships lobbying the government to make it illegal for them to sell their product to people that want their product, that want to pay money for their product, all in voluntary transactions. And they're basically trying to aggressively stop me from buying a Tesla in my home state. And they're doing it through trying to get the legitimacy of the state, of the government, by lobbying for those regulations. So, and it's a great example of dodging evolution. The evolutionary function here is at present, at least for a while, saying, hey, people want Teslas. They're willing to pay the money for these all electric cars that are really cool.
Yeah. So one question, something I want to clear up, it's a little bit tangential, but you talk about evolution and the forces of evolution, which and the forces of reality of evolution will crush resistances to it. In many ways, don't you think that we also want to? We don't want to just assume that because evolution happens, therefore it's good.
Yeah.
I mean, like if evolution to me sounds like the survival of the fittest and the weak. No help for the weak. Too bad, you're weak. You'll just die. We don't necessarily want that, right? So if you can kind of explain what you mean.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it's awesome. So, well, first, to just acknowledge the point, if you are a taxi cab driver and you are being threatened by Uber providing better service at better rates that customers are voluntarily choosing to go to, and it might force you to rethink your business and your profession, you don't want evolution, probably, right? If you run an auto dealership and you're making great money selling all these gasoline-powered cars, and in comes this scary competitor that has a really cool product that people are flocking to and it's costing you business, you don't want evolution. In fact, you probably want to prevent evolution. And by evolution, I'm not intending to add a moral judgment to that, although any of us may choose to say, hey, I value evolution. It's easy to say that when it doesn't affect you directly. It's a lot harder when you're the car dealer. But I think there is, if our broader goal is generally giving more people access to more of what they want and less of what they don't, if our broader goal is economic development, and the framing of our talk here was in our broader world, evolution's a really powerful force for economic development, because ultimately it doesn't care whether you have a car dealership and that's your livelihood and you don't want Tesla to come in and compete with you. It only cares who's offering a valuable service that people want to flock to. Again, with the assumption that you're not externalizing costs and causing harm along the way. And right now that's an assumption that's not true at all, right? Right now, there's massive numbers of companies that are externalizing costs and causing harm to others along the way of generating value. And many of them do it by lobbying to make what they want to externalize legal. The hiding it method of the mafia, or dodging justice, it's actually the minority. I think most companies do it just by legitimately, through the right legislation, dodging justice and dodging evolution in the process.
Yeah, so what I think I'm hearing that you're saying is that, to me, that what clicks is evolution for what? And from what I hear you say, it's evolution for, so that's that purpose thing. Like, what's the purpose of evolution in that case? And you're saying it's serving more economic development and more people having access to
all evolution has a fitness function, right? In Holacracy, we talk about purpose being the fitness function of evolution. In a market, the fitness function, if you will, if left unhampered, unhindered, and if it can have an environment where aggression is not a viable means of influence, right, then what evolution does in a market is optimize for maximizing wants and needs of everybody involved and getting the right goods to the right place and the right flows to maximize those wants and needs and desires. It's a resource allocation function. What evolution does, similar to what it does in a company running with Holacracy, when you really are at speed and you've got the right apps in place. In the broader market, what an evolutionary market does is try to figure out where to allocate scarce resources, where to allocate funds, where to allocate attention. Should we, as a society, be making more iPhones or making more Android phones or whatever? Should we be making more Teslas or more Ford Explorers or whatever? It helps us sort that out without any one person having to anticipate and control it. But it's not functioning very effectively right now. There's lots of stuff in the way of that. That's what it tends towards until we have all of people dodging it, externalizing costs, and aggressing in various forms. That gets in the way of that optimization for the fitness function of satisfying people's wants without hurting them along the way, without making them worse off through violating their fundamental property and person and rights.
Gotcha. So great. So now I kind of want to come back to one thing you offered is, does Holacracy offer anything, any insight, even just from the I heard you say we need more than holacracy to solve those issues, okay,
Yeah.
at the broader system, societal level. And yet, my question is, does holacracy provide any insights or help in any way with those, or is it just another topic that we don't want to talk about?
Yeah, I think so. For me, one of the things that Holacracy does is increase my awareness of the nature of evolutionary systems and evolutionary designs, and help me understand better what supports or what gets in the way of that. I think if we look at going back to our example of ways companies can fight evolution and actually succeed today all the time at fighting this natural evolutionary selection towards creating more value for more people, which is in a totally voluntary set of transactions that don't externalize costs, we maximize providing value for people through voluntary transactions. But let's talk about justice system, because I think one of the key things we need is a justice system that people have access to, that is effective, that itself is evolutionary. And there's two great examples of legal codes and ways justice can work in our society today. There's common law versus legislated law or regulation, which often follows the same principle. Civil law, it's often called. And I know this is more detailed than my average reader might care to get into, but since you asked, common law is a beautifully evolutionary legal framework. And common law goes back centuries, many centuries, and it's what happens when you leave the legal code to evolve and sort out on its own through a trusted justice institute. So, for example, if you and I are neighbors and we have a dispute, if we live in a village in medieval Europe and we have a bit of a dispute, your sheep are grazing on my land, and you know what? They eat all of my prized crops. And I feel like you have done an injustice to me, right, or whatever. Then I can go to a trusted justice arbiter, whether that's a local court or whatever we call it in our society. There's been many names for these over many different cultures and societies. But if it's a court, I can go there and I can bring my case. And what common law does is look at the specifics of a real tension. Going back to holacracy, the real tension I have right here is I feel like you violated the autonomy of me and my rightful property and all that. And I can say, the domain, here's my case, and from that, you can make your case if you have one, or you can own up to it and say, I'm sorry, let's make this right. Or you can fight it and say, no, I don't think I did, and here's why, and you didn't put up a fence or whatever. And the court can look at all the facts and circumstances and say, in this case, here's what feels right through a trusted third-party arbiter, right? And law can evolve from that. So there's a whole body of common law that has never been legislated by any legislature, and yet, in fact, it's the majority of the laws that I operate in the current jurisdiction I'm in the United States and in any state in the US, but in Pennsylvania, the vast body of law that's applying to me is common law. It's not something that the government has legislated. It's something that has evolved by case, and it does evolve as technology evolves, things change. The law itself evolves case by case. And that's what, when you hear of precedent, what courts do is they look at the evolutionary history, and then they look at the current facts and say, well, wait a minute, does anything need to evolve in this? And they make rulings. And so there's an evolutionary legal standard, and that's in sharp contrast to legislated law. When a government says, here's what we're going to define as a law, that's often coming from a very different state. It's often much more predictive, and it's much more subject to control that fights a natural evolutionary process. So, for example, a lot of the original problems with pollution in the industrialized world in England did not come from a failure of common law. It came from legislated laws coming in and trumping common law. It came from industrialists who had a lot more money to buy the government, to buy lobbyists, right? Came in, and when the farmers were saying, hey, your factories are polluting our fields and our rivers and our airspace and all of this, the industrialists simply buy enough lobbying power to have laws put in place through legislated means that say, oh, no, that's not illegal. It doesn't matter whether you can make an actual really good case for why it's harming something that you should have just right to, right? The legislated laws can trump that by saying this is legal and this is not. And it's so much easier to fight evolution if you have a lot of money and you can target a lobbying body that can supersede the evolutionary common law framework with a legislated law. And a lot of our regulatory systems have the same issue, where they become easily controlled by the very forces that they're trying to regulate. And when they do that, it actually gets in the way of the evolutionary process. It gets in the way of somebody being able to file a lawsuit and say, wait, I don't care what the legislated law says. This is violating something that in our society should be considered legitimate property, or something I can legitimately control, or violating me, myself, personally. And here's why, and here's my case. So ironically, if we look at what's in the way of evolution, it's often the very thing that we think is meant to protect us from the forces of the companies we often see externalizing costs. Ironically, that gives them a nice single point of target. If you want to dodge those harsh forces of evolution, just buy off the very thing that's meant to control you and make sure you do, and get them on your side because you have bigger pocketbooks, and that's really hard. And all of that is at the expense of a more evolutionary legal code. Oh, and by the way, if you even want access to the courts, even the ones that will apply common law to your case, the money cost, do you know how much it costs to take something through the court system? If you're an average guy, you don't have the money to deal with lawsuits. It's insanely expensive, and you only have one source of it. You can use the courts, which, by the way, are controlled by those same corporations indirectly through the government that try to buy it off and dodge evolution. So the whole system right now is not very conducive of an evolutionary society.
So it sounds to me like there is you're making a parallel with holacracy within an organization. When I see an organization working without holacracy, I can see also people actually using the organization to serve themselves at the detriment of the organization itself, by fighting the evolution of the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. We see that play out, especially in the early days of a company applying holacracy. It's often nobody, again, when it's you that's the subject of evolution and you're being selected away from, or your favorite pet project is being deselected because it's not serving the purpose well, right? That's where people tend to fight evolution. And what holacracy does is create a rather ruthless focus on what serves the purpose, and everything gets selected for that. Not who can politically have the most clout, but what serves the purpose. Not who's the loudest voice in the room or who has the most powerful position in the room, but what serves the purpose. And everything has to be grounded in real cases, real tensions, as we evolve our legal code in the company to best serve that purpose. So it's creating a real environment where nobody can do that. But when we look at the parallel in our broader world, that same protection holacracy provides is shaky at best outside of the walls of the organization. It's much easier to fight evolution by being political, or being the loudest voice in the room, or the one with the most powerful position. So I think an interesting thing is look at what serves to create an environment in which evolution can thrive, and what serves to distort the fitness function to be instead serving the most powerful, the loudest, the most political, instead of serving the purpose or serving the creation of value. And if I look at that, I think there's one fundamental principle that we can apply that I think is really intriguing. It's known in the broader world as the non-aggression principle, and you see it show up in holacracy. So the non-aggression principle says, basically, do whatever you want to express your purpose in life, your purpose in the world, as long as you don't initiate violence, aggress against somebody else. That's not to say you can't defend yourself, even violently, if you need to. It's the initiation of violence. The non-aggression principle says, generally society works better, life works better, and I'd add evolution works better to create value for people when we honor a basic stance of non-aggression, of do whatever you want to serve your purpose, just don't violate something that is the legitimate person of someone else or property of someone else by initiating violence against it or threatening violence against it. And we see that in holacracy with the stance we talked about, where when you fill a role, you have the authority under that constitution to do anything that makes sense to you to express your purpose in that company for that role, as long as you don't violate the domain of another role. That's an example of the non-aggression principle within the context of an organization. And that same principle is really useful in our broader societies, although we don't see it operating all that much today. We do in some basic ways, but if we really dig in, we see we're nowhere near it. And that principle is the same in your broader life, and the same for our corporations and our companies in the world today. Do whatever you want to serve your purpose, as long as you don't violate, aggress, initiate violence, or threaten violence against the person or property of others. The trouble today is people can do that through the state's legitimacy by getting the right legislated laws passed and violate the common law process of figuring that out. And even if somebody wants to challenge it, all they can do is challenge it in the courts that are themselves subject to legislated law. So we have a lot of things that are getting in the way of that natural evolutionary process. Yeah.
So let me play the devil's advocate and ask you a question talking about purpose. So in Holacracy, everything is anchored in the purpose of the organization. In society, it's less clear, and as much as lobbies can influence the laws that get passed and all that to fight evolution when it's threatening them, there is still a function of that state and those laws that they are kind of here to coordinate us or make sure that we are, as a country or society, going in the same direction, and therefore somehow working toward a common purpose. But so if it's not that, I guess it's my question, is that the purpose that as a society we need to work toward, or is it not the purpose? Is it something else?
I'd say for me, I think it would be hubris that I will, at least at this point in my life, try not to commit, although I've done it in the past many times. It would be hubris, arrogance in the extreme, for me to say, here's the purpose of society. I think that as soon as we try to do that and apply our idea of the purpose to others, that gets us into dangerous waters. And ultimately, if we then start using violence or threat of violence, and legislated law is backed by threat of violence, if we start doing that to apply our idea of purpose on others, we have an issue.
But that's what we do every 5 years or 4 years in the US when we elect someone.
We do. We look at, and if we take as a given the system we operate in, there's no good solution for the challenges to an evolutionary society that I'm pointing out and the forces of evolution. I think we have to question things at a much deeper level. As soon as we're operating in a system where we have to compete to see who gets to use violence or threat of violence, and legislated law is backed by threat of violence, that means who gets to buy the legislatures or elect the legislatures. There's a nice competition between, do we get to elect them or do we buy them because we have a lot of money to hire lobbyists? Right now, I'd argue that they're bought more than they are actually genuinely elected. But even then, even if we are truly able to restore election, we're still saying 51% gets to push through threat of violence on the others. So I think we need to question the entire fundamental system and ask instead, how can we get to a basic stance that leaves, just like holacracy leaves each role free to do its purpose as long as it doesn't violate domain of others, how do we leave each person free to express their purpose as long as they don't violate the domain of others, as long as they don't violate somebody's personhood or legitimate property or whatever, and free our evolutionary legal frameworks like common law to do that. And I think if we want to do that, the first thing we have to look at are what are the monopolies getting in the way of people simply choosing a more effective way? Because as soon as people can make a choice without threat of violence, you unleash an evolutionary process because people will start making choices that serve better, including choices to defend themselves against others' violence. And I'd say one of the first choices we have to look at is choice of courts. Right now, unless you're pretty wealthy, forget it. Our courts don't serve you. And even worse, they're so subject to the laws that were often bought through the right lobbyists. So, courts are not serving the very people that they're supposedly designed to protect in most of our countries today. So the first thing I'd suggest is, what happens if we allow evolution and evolutionary selection to work at the level of courts? What if you don't like our broader state courts? Choose a different court. Let them hear your case. Let them apply more of a common law framework to it. And if there's a dispute, well, there's processes to resolve disputes. And we see that even today. If there's, we see all the time, actually, international law, which is another evolutionary legal framework, because there is no legislature to dominate it. So it becomes an evolutionary thing of court in one jurisdiction, court in another, sometimes come to different opinions and then have to integrate across them. And we can do the same thing if we have a more of an evolutionary system of you choose your court, let entrepreneurs be entrepreneurs in better ways of justice and of applying legal standards and the idea of restoring aggression, of honoring this non-aggression principle. And as soon as we can do that, then great, we're going to have disputes across courts, and we need ways to sort that out. And fortunately, we already have plenty of them in place today with appeals process, and a lot of this gets sorted out if we allow evolution to work. But to do that, we got to remove the things that are in the way. One of the biggest things in the way right now is a monopoly on justice from a single centralized provider that actually, through threat of violence, stops others from competing. And that is what we think of as our governments today. And the government is very easily bought. Sad but true.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're telling us, just like with Holacracy, you're telling us to, you cannot patch the organization. You need to challenge its fundamental power structure, the way it's fundamentally structured. You're telling us the same thing for society as a whole.
Yeah, it's the same shift. So when we look at what Holacracy does, and what I cover a lot in the book is this is not just a shift to making better leaders, which is a lot of what we see people in the world doing today for companies trying to make better companies. Let's make better leadership, better companies, better authority held, more effectively by a centralized force, better top-down direction of resources, better whatever. What Holacracy does is say, question that fundamental idea of authority resting that way, and change our idea of what authority is and where authority vests, where it comes from. We shift to a constitution holding authority that distributes authority across roles. I think in the world today, when we see how people are trying to reform our broader societal systems, there's often still the assumption that we have this centralized authority to legislate. And by legislate, I do mean legislate in ways that legitimize what aggression is okay and allow aggressive acts to be okay, or prevent through threat of violence non-aggressive acts. Like, for example, all the laws in the books around gay marriage or drug laws. A lot of these are preventing something that is actually fundamentally a non-aggressive act, and yet the state's saying, no, we're going to, through threat of violence, stop you from doing it. So if we instead question that fundamental centralized authority, and instead of looking to our governments to protect us from all of the corporations and individuals that might want to fight evolution from time to time by externalizing costs, by limiting us or whatever, if we stop looking to just reform them and make them better authority holders, and instead say, well, what happens if we just blow that whole thing open and distribute authority? What happens if we have courts that are freed to be evolutionary, entrepreneurs that are free to innovate in justice, in defense, in all of these different ways, within a fundamental framework of if you aggress against someone else, then you know what? People are free to go find their court and to have that court authorize defensive violence to stop it. So we don't start legislating what's acceptable aggression. We just start from a ground that allows people to protect themselves and allows entrepreneurs to provide valuable services around protecting people. And we actually see this happening all over the world today in interesting little pockets, whether it's Detroit having a really cool police force that's emerging, that's a private police force and providing an incredibly purpose-driven service. We see it. I mean, we see it in other aspects of our economy all the time, but we're so locked into thinking that we need this monopoly protective authority holder of the government to provide certain services, justice, police, roads, things like that. We need those services, absolutely. But they don't have to be provided by a centralized monopoly provider that defines what's acceptable aggression and what isn't. If we blow that same authority open the same way Holacracy does, I think we have a path to a very different world.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much for all the
Thanks, Olivier.
food for thoughts.
Yeah, appreciate it. Have a good day. See ya.
See ya.